All right, well, we are on day 4, and the part of the Bible you're going to be reading today is Matthew 2:13 through 23. It's a little bit longer, so I'm going to just let you pause here, go ahead and read it, and see what you get from it, and then I will come back and talk about it for just a few. So go ahead and give it a pause and give it a read. Matthew 2:13 through 23. All right, so one thing that you can learn as you read through the Bible is that there are going to be some parts that you get to that don't have a whole lot of direct instruction or application for us. Parts where there are no commands given, no you shalls or you shoulds, or there's no moral imperative discussed. And I think this is kind of one of those parts. It's just kind of telling us a little bit about history, a little bit about what Mary and Joseph went through following Jesus's birth in his early years. But I think there's still some great lessons you can glean from this part of the scriptures. The Bible tells us that all scripture is God-breathed and all of it is profitable for something. Even the parts that are a little bit boring. We saw that in the genealogies the other day. We saw how even just a long list of names can be profitable and how we can take something away from it. So we can get something from this too. And there were two things in here that I noticed that I thought were pretty cool. And the first one, I think, is how we see how cool it is that when God calls Mary and Joseph to such a monumentous task, he also provides for them. We know a few things about Mary and Joseph from the scriptures and from some of the context surrounding what the scriptures tell us. First, we know that they lost a lot of their societal safety net due to the circumstances around Jesus's birth. We talked a little bit about that a couple of days ago, how Joseph knew that if he went on with the marriage, it would appear that they had broken some of the Jewish laws, or that Mary had broken. Maybe she hadn't been faithful and had committed adultery, or maybe it would look like that they hadn't been faithful to each other, that they took things too quickly and didn't wait the year before having relations before they got married. And so either way, no matter, even though Joseph and Mary knew they had done nothing wrong, even though they had had the explanation to them, maybe some of the community members probably wouldn't buy their story. So we know that they definitely would have faced losing out on some of their societal safety nets. They lost out on their community or their friends or some of their family providing for them in the way that they likely would have normally in the situation they found themselves in. We also know that Joseph was a carpenter. And now these days, carpenters make bank. You can be a carpenter, you can build houses, buildings, businesses, stuff like that. You can make just as much as an engineer or a doctor or a IT professional. But back in Bible days, carpenters would have been some of the poorest members of society. We also know that they were a poor family based off the sacrifices they gave when they went to the temple to dedicate Jesus. And so the Bible tells us when it came time for them to go to the temple and do the sacrifices for having a new baby, they ended up offering what would be the impoverished sacrifice. So all the way back in Leviticus 12, the Bible tells you about these sacrifices, and it says that when you have a baby, when you bring them to the temple, when it's time to offer the sacrifice, if you can, you provide a lamb as the sacrifice. But if you didn't have the money, if you didn't have the funds, if you were a poor family, the Bible provided a way that you could offer sacrifices as well. And it says to give 2 doves. And this is what Mary and Joseph did for Jesus. They offered 2 turtle doves. And so what that tells us is that they were only able to afford quite literally a few pennies, a few cents for their sacrifice. And so that tells us pretty clearly that they were quite impoverished. And so all of these things together, the lack of the societal safety net, the low-paying career, knowing that they're impoverished based off of their sacrifice, that kind of tells us that they're not really in any financial position to just be able to uproot, to leave what work they do have, to leave what family and friends they do have left in order to go to Egypt to make sure that Jesus is safe. They wouldn't normally be able to do that, I don't think. But what a lot of commentators say about the gifts of the wise men is that they were actually provisions by God to provide for them to be able to take Jesus to Egypt. And I think that kind of holds some weight, really. I mean, otherwise, the gifts that they gave them, gold and frankincense and myrrh, gold and expensive spices, are not exactly the type of toys you would think a little baby or a little toddler would want to play with. So I think this holds some weight that this was God's provision for Mary and Joseph to be able to go to Egypt and provide for Jesus, even as they were away from home because of what Herod was doing. The Bible tells us that sometimes God calls us to difficult things. Sometimes he has us do it or ask us to do something and we have absolutely no understanding or no idea how we're going to be able to do it. But the Bible also tells us faithful is he who calls us and he will bring it to pass. So that was the first thing I think is cool, that God called Mary and Joseph to this difficult task and he provided even in the really hard times. The second thing that I think is pretty important from this passage that we see is the way that sin, when it's left unchecked, sin, when it's left unrepented in our heart, when it's just left there to fester, it continues to take us to darker and darker places. Sin, I guess to give you an example from my life recently, I almost compare it to the infection I just recently had. As I went to my doctor, it turned out that I had strep throat, and then the strep throat, the bacteria from that caused a whole upper respiratory infection in my sinuses, in my bronchioles. It ended up spreading into my eyes. It was a horrendous infection, and it happened because I didn't know it was strep throat, and I left the strep throat untreated. And so then it was just allowed that bacteria, it could fester, it could spread. And it could have gotten much worse if it weren't for the antibiotics, which stopped the whole process, which reversed it. And so in the same way, I think that sin oftentimes will do the same thing in our spiritual lives. We see with Herod, when he heard that there was a king of the Jews, immediately he was jealous, he was prideful, kind of egotistical. He was outraged at the thought of somebody claiming to be the king of the Jews. And today we see in this passage that his jealousy, it took him to an incredibly dark place, that he was willing to mass murder hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent little babies just to make sure that no one has opposed his rule. And so history tells us, historians tell us, that at this point, Herod had already murdered several of his siblings to ensure that his throne was secure. Herod, it seems like he was pretty paranoid, that he kind of had a God complex, that he was thinking that he had to ensure the safety of his rule no matter what. So much so that he was willing to kill these innocent children in order to feel secure. And of course, God ends up protecting Jesus and his family. God's plan is going to continue despite Herod trying to stop it. But even though Herod fails, there are a lot of innocent little lives that pay the price for Herod's sin. And so I think that serves as a good warning for us as well, that when we let sin continue to fester in our hearts, when we let sinful thoughts, sinful actions in our lives continue to go on unchecked, they lead us to darker and darker places. And, eventually we kind of just look back and say, how in the world did we get here? And so that's kind of what it was I took away from today, that God will provide when he calls us to do difficult tasks, and then that sin will take you to much further than you ever wanted to go, and take you to some really dark places. So don't let it have that foothold in your life. Don't be a Herod. Hope you guys found some things out of it today as well, and tomorrow we'll be getting into Matthew 3.